viéndote que te estoy dando trabajo.
Aquí me parece que
Como si tuviera un poco.
Me parece que estoy ante un rupee respondiéndote.
Eso es lo mucho que me quiere. Hi.
Can you, because we're live on YouTube, so if you can just mute yourself.
Rob,
for the
we're
moment.
live on YouTube.
No,
okay?
but I have no problem. This is an exchange between
yeah, but
Rob, we're live.
We're live, Barbara, so can you mute? Thank you. And Ambassador Pedroso, can you mute for the moment? And Salim, also mute. Good evening, everybody. My name is Rob Miller and I'm the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in the UK. We're just waiting for a few more people to join with us tonight. We have over 400 registrations. People are watching on YouTube. So we'll be starting in about 1 minute's time. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. As I said, my name is Rob Miller. I'm the director here of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign here in Britain. And I'm hosting this meeting tonight, which is titled Unpicking the Blockade, a history of US policy against Cuba and the international movement to end it. And this meeting is a part of a mini series of 3 or 4 meetings that we're running up in the build up to the vote at the United Nations in June this year. And we're really delighted to welcome our special guests here tonight. We're really honoured to have with us Ambassador Pedro Pedroso, the Cuban ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations, who joins us live tonight from the United States. I'm very pleased we have with us Paula Barker, Member of Parliament for Wavertree, which is a constituency in the northwest of Britain, for those of us our guests from around the world. And we also have our very good friend Salim Lamrani, an academic and an author. And we'll introduce more later. I'm also very pleased, although she's not a formal panelist tonight, that we have the presence of the Cuban ambassador here to the United Kingdom, Her Excellency Barbara Montalvo Alvarez, who will be with us this evening and may say a few words later on. So just regarding the format for the meeting, I'm going to ask Salim to start us off, followed by Ambassador Pedroso, and then Paula will say a few words. And I know many of you have put some questions to us in advance. We've got 3 or 4 questions already. But if you have any more questions you'd like to put, please add them to the question boxes now on YouTube or wherever you're watching. And please let us know where you're watching from in the chat box so we can see where our guests are watching tonight. We aim to finish this meeting by 7:45 UK time, which is in about an hour and 15 minutes. So first of all, I'd like to thank Salim for joining with us tonight. I believe you're joining with us from the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean, where you're a lecturer at the University of Reunion. So I know it's quite late in the evening there because of the time difference. So we're very, very grateful, Salim, that you took the time to join us. And Salim's written a number of books on Cuba in particular, including one book, The Blockade. And tonight he is going to give us an overview of the evolution of the US sanctions policy and also its extraterritorial nature and its reach in Europe. Thank you, Salim. Over to you.
Hi, thanks, Bob. Thank you for your invitation.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this conference. I'll try to respect the time. So let me draw a little perspective on US-Cuba relations. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution got to power, and Eisenhower administration imposed immediately in 1960 the first economic sanctions. It's interesting to underline that the diplomatic rhetoric to justify the sanctions against Cuba have evolved according to the periods, according to the decades. In 1960, when the Eisenhower administration imposed the first economic sanctions, the official reason was because Cuba had nationalized some US properties. And then when the Kennedy administration 2 years later imposed full economic sanctions towards the island, it was because of the alliance with the Soviet Union. And then in the 70s, in the beginning of the 80s, the official reason changed again. It was not because of the nationalization, it was not because of the alliance with the Soviet Union, but it was because of the contribution that Cuba gave to independent movements around the world, especially in Africa. And then in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. 2 years later, the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991. So if all the diplomatic rhetoric used by the US in the previous 30 years had any basis, the United States would have normalized the relations with Cuba. But instead of that, the United States increased the economic sanctions towards the island, adopting the Helms-Burton Act, in the Torricelli Act first in 1992, that gives an extraterritorial aspect to the economic sanctions that increases the difficulties of Cuba to develop its international trade with the rest of the world. It is obviously illegal according to international law. Then 4 years later, in 1996, under the liberal administration of Clinton, the United States increased again the economic sanctions towards the island with the Helms-Burton Act. That is, from a legal point of view, an aberration, because it is not only extraterritorial, that is to say, the US law on sanctions applies to every single country in the world. But it's also retroactive. That is to say that the law of the Helms-Burton Act applies for events that happened before 1996. We all know that there are some basic principles in international law. A law cannot be retroactive and it can be extraterritorial. The French law cannot be applied in England. The Spanish law cannot be applied in Italy. But the US legislation on sanctions against Cuba applies to every single country in the world. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, the Torricelli Act. If a French boat goes to Cuba to deliver some products during 6 months, this French boat cannot enter the US territory. So what's the consequence of this? It increases the obstacles for the island to develop its trade with the rest of the world, with France, with Europe, with the rest of the world. Then in 2000, the Bush administration arrived to power, and 4 years later, in 2004, it adopted new restrictions, new sanctions against the Cuban people. The most emblematic aspect of it was the one adopted against the Cuban families. From May 2004 to September 2009, the Cuban community in the United States could not travel to the island more than 2 weeks every 3 years, in the best of the cases, because to be allowed by the Treasury Department to travel to Cuba, let's say Cuban who lived in Miami, who lives in Miami, who wanted to travel to the island, he had to show to the Treasury Department that he had a direct member of the family in the island. For us, for everybody, a direct member of the family is an uncle, is a cousin, is a you know, in the general meaning of the family that we all share. But the Bush administration gave a new definition of the family. The Cuban family for the Bush administration was only the parents, the brothers, the sons. So a Cuban who lived in Miami and who had only an aunt in Havana could not travel to the island, never, not even 2 weeks every 3 years. At the same time, the Bush administration limited the amount of remesas, of the money transfer that it could send to the family in the island, to $100 per month. A Mexican could send $1,000 per month to his family in Mexico, but the Cuban could only send $100. There were several reasons for this. The first one was an economic reason, because the money that the Cuban community in the United States sends to Cuba represents the second source of income for the island. And then the second aspect was a political one, because before 2004, the community, the minority in the United States that traveled more often to his country of origin was the Cuban one. And it was a contradiction with the definition, not the definition, sorry for my English, with the category that the United States gives to the Cubans. Every single Cuban in the United States is considered as a political exile. A Mexican is considered as an economic migrant. But every single Cuban in the United States is considered as a political exile. But the reality of the travels to the island show that the vast majority of the Cuban community in the United States was composed by economic migrants who wanted to have normal relations with their country of origin. We cannot imagine, to give an example, we cannot imagine a Spanish political exile under Franco in France going every single year to Spain during the Franco dictatorship. We cannot imagine a Chilean political exiles under Pinochet going every single year to Chile. But the Cubans from the United States traveled every single year, and sometimes several times a year. This reality shows that the vast majority of the Cuban community in the United States is composed of economic migrants who want to have normal relations with their country of origin. So this was the most emblematic measure adopted by the Bush administration. Then in 2006, the so-called Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba published a second report increasing sanctions against the island, especially the extraterritorial aspect of it. To give an example, if Cuba can't buy and can't sell anything to the United States, can't buy cars from the United States, and they can't sell anything to the United States because of the economic sanctions. But let's imagine that Cuba produces nickel. Do we say nickel in English? Yeah, Cuba produces nickel. So if Cuba wants to sell nickel to France or to Germany, because you know the Germany builds cars too, like Mercedes and BMW, if they can't do it, because in order to sell, if let's say BMW wants to sell its cars in the US market, which is the biggest market in the world with the Chinese one, they have to show to the Treasury Department that their cars don't have 1 single gram of Cuban nickel. So the Cubans can't sell their nickel to the United States. But in this case, because of the extraterritorial aspect of the sanctions, they can't sell it to Germany, they can't sell it to Japan, they can't sell it to South Korea, for example, to name, you know, some countries who build cars. So then came the Obama administration in 2008. Obama was elected one of the Florida state, basing his campaign on a new Cuba policy. He said he would lift the restrictions on the Cuban family, and he did so. But until 2014 and the beginning of the normalization process that we all are aware about, the Obama administration was the one who imposed more sanctions to foreign companies that had trade relations or financial relations with Cuba. So we have to nuance a little bit the Obama administration policy. In 2014, we all know that Obama, who is an intelligent man, understood that he had to build a new Cuba policy, a new approach towards Cuba, for several reasons. First of all, because the US foreign policy towards Cuba is a failure. It is rejected by the vast majority of the international community. Since 1992, every single year, you have an overwhelming majority in the United Nations asking for the lifting of the US sanctions towards the island, because these sanctions represent the first obstacle to Cuba development, because these sanctions affect every single category of the Cuban population, affects all sectors of its economy. And of course, it is legally illegitimate. It is morally condemnable. How do we say that in English? You can only condemn it from a moral point of view, and even from a political point of view, it's a failure, because instead of isolating Cuba, this policy has isolated the United States in the international community. Even this, to give you an example, even the best allies of the United States in Latin America, like Colombia, asked for the lifting of US economic sanctions. So then Obama understood this reality and took constructive decisions towards a normalization of the relations with Cuba, or towards finding a modus vivendi with Cuba. From my point of view, it was not a strategic change, but only a tactical one. Obama understood. I don't think that Obama accepted the fact that Cuba is an independent country that has the right to decide its own destiny, its own political system, its own economic and social system, etc. But he thought that the policy of sanctions was not productive and was counterproductive, and he chose to a new approach based on economic more relations between both countries, economic investments in the island from maybe the Cuban community, etc. Why do I say that? Because we have to compare the rhetoric of President Obama and his actions. Obama, for example, called the Congress to lift the U.S. Economic sanctions towards the island. On the United Nations that year, I guess it was 2015 or 16, the U.S. abstained from voting on the Cuban resolution against the economic sanctions. But as President of the United States, Barack Obama could have dismantled 90% of the economic sanctions. If I'm not mistaken, there are only 4 aspects that the President of the United States, even now Joe Biden, can't touch without the agreement of the Congress. For example, Obama can't allow U.S. we say subsidiaries in foreign countries, like let's say Ford company in Panama is not allowed to sell cars to Cuba. That's right. Only the U.S. Congress can authorize it. But President Obama can allow, or President Biden now, can allow bilateral trade between both countries. So if Cuba can buy Ford cars in Miami, they don't need to go to Panama to buy it. The second aspect of the second point that the President of the United States cannot touch without the agreement of the Congress is that Cuba can't buy food products on credit to the United States. That's true. But the United States can sell every other single product, which is not food, by credit. So I think the Cuban would be willing to pay cash for the food if the United States allowed them to buy all of the products, as we do in everywhere else in the world. You never pay cash. You have 3-6 months to pay, 9 months to pay, or 1 year to pay. That's how international trade works. The third aspect, if I'm not mistaken, is that the President of the United States cannot allow U.S. investments in properties in Cuba that belonged before 1959 to U.S. companies without the agreement of the Congress because of the Helms-Burton Act. But it can allow investment in other properties that did not belong to U.S. citizens in 1959. And the fourth aspect of it, to tell the truth, I don't remember which one it was, but there's a fourth aspect. So I know my time is limited. What happened with the Trump administration? The Trump administration went back to a hostile policy, went back to the policy of confrontation with the island, with Cuba, went back to the anachronistic policy of aggression towards the island, which hasn't worked. It only increased the difficulties for the Cuban population, especially the most vulnerable categories of the Cuban population. The Trump administration adopted more than 200 major sanctions against the island. And what is the result of it? Nothing. It only increased the rejection, the international rejection of U.S. Policy towards Cuba, and from a practical aspect, it can't have any positive result for one reason. It is that you can only deal with the Cuban people respecting 3 principles. You have to respect what we call the sovereignty of the country. You have to deal with them respecting that the fact that they are your equal. You can't talk you can't have an asymmetric relationship with the Cuban people. It's in their idiosyncrasy. Do we say idiosyncrasy in English? The second aspect is you can only deal with the Cubans based on a policy of reciprocity. If you want to talk about human rights, if the United States want to talk about human rights in Cuba, they have to accept that the Cubans talk about human rights in the United States. And then the third aspect is you cannot interfere in the internal affairs of the Cuban people, because the political system, the socioeconomic system is an exclusive competence of the Cuban people, because it's a sovereign country. And I will finish with this. Cuban history has shown that the Cubans are not sensitive to the language of force, to the language of threat, to the language of blackmail. The only relationship you can have with the Cubans is a relationship based on respect, based on international law, and based on the fact that you have to accept that Cuba is an independent entity, an independent country that only belongs to the Cuban.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Salim. I'm going to stop you there, and we'll have some more time at the end, I'm sure, for you to come back on some questions and some points, but really brilliant. And it's great to see the trajectory of US policy changing over the years to the policy we have today, which, of course, we hope will be rejected at the United Nations. Just so people are aware, Ambassador Pedroso represents Cuba at the United Nations. And every year for the last 20 plus years, there's been a vote at the United Nations on a motion put forward by Cuba. I'm sure many of you will know this, but for some of you who don't. And the countries of the world have voted with Cuba. And in the last few years, it's been absolutely unanimous. In fact, in the last vote in 2019, 187 countries, including all the countries of the European Union and the British government, voted in favor of Cuba's resolution against the blockade. And it was really only the United States, Israel, and I think Brazil last time around that voted to maintain the blockade. So we're going to be talking in a minute with Ambassador Pedroso about that vote, that process, and the discussions in the build-up to that vote. Before that, we sell Salim's books on our website. You can buy them from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. And can I also take this opportunity, if any of you are not members of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, do join the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. There are messages on the chat box out there. If you join, you get our magazine 4 times a year, and we have many articles from people like Salim often in the magazine, and you also get a bag, a nice eco bag and a badge, but above all you'll be helping the Cuban people, and it's the best way to show solidarity with the country at this time. Now I'm really very honoured to welcome our next guest, Ambassador Pedro Luis Pedroso Cuesta, his full title. And Ambassador Pedroso, I know is very busy because obviously at the UN, it's a very busy period in the build up to the vote in June. It was due to be in May, but I know it's been delayed somewhat, and you can say a bit about that. So thank you so much for joining us. I understand you've only recently taken up your post at the United Nations, and it's a very difficult time. You've just had the United States elections, the change from Trump to Biden, of course, and of course, we've had the pandemic, which has obviously impacted people across the globe, in Cuba, in the States, and obviously the whole process of the UN has been affected also. This meeting is about the illegal US blockade of Cuba and the annual resolution, which will be put before the General Assembly in June. And I know you're going to talk about the impact of the blockade in Cuba and also the history and importance of this annual vote to the UN. And if there is time, perhaps you can give us an insight into what you think may happen this year at the United Nations, but also we would like to hear from you about the role of international solidarity and how we as campaigners around the world can get involved in helping Cuba at this time and in general in the campaign against the blockade. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for having me today. Good evening almost to all those joining from the UK and similar time zones around the world. I really thank the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in the UK, and particularly you, Prab, for the opportunity to speak on this vital topic for my people and the world, and to do it in such a notable company. I also want to thank my fellow colleague, Ambassador Barbara Montalvo, for all the effort she has displayed. As you said, I've been invited to talk a little bit about the impact of economic sanctions in Cuba, the history of the voting in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and the importance of the international solidarity movement. Before going to specifics, I think it is important to remember that this is an almost 60 decades old policy. Therefore, the damage it has caused is a cumulative damage to the Cuban people. 6 generations of Cubans have born under the blockade. We also need to understand the blockade as a serious, flagrant, and systematic violation of the human rights of the Cuban people that affects every aspect of life, and also has a damaging and real impact on the process of updating the Cuban economic model and Cuba's path towards sustainable development. Another key element to understand how the blockade affects our everyday lives is to realize that the Cuba is currently barred by the US government to import from any country products containing more than 10% of US components. This not only means that we are cut off from our neighboring US market, but that even when we intend to buy products in distant markets, it becomes a very lengthy and difficult ordeal that will undoubtedly result in several times more expensive transactions. The past 4 decades, the past 4 years, that means the period of the Trump administration, has been a period of unprecedented levels of hostility from the US government towards Cuba. During this period, over 240 new regulations and provisions were issued by the US government against Cuba. Notably amongst them are the possibility of establishing lawsuit on the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, the increased persecution of Cuba's financial and commercial transactions, the ban on flights from the US to all Cuban provinces except Havana, the persecution and intimidation of companies that send fuel supplies to Cuba, and the campaign to discredit Cuban medical cooperation programs, which are some of the most distinctive examples. In terms of economic damage, we have registered that from April 2019 to March 2020, just 1 year, the blockade caused losses estimated at over $5.5 billion. That is in just 1 year. The damage accumulated during almost 60 decades go over well $1,444 billion at current prices. You can understand that for a small economy like Cuba, that is truly an overwhelming burden. But as I said, just the damage that is just the damage that can be quantified, because the social, human, and psychological damage of the blockade is far more difficult to assess. Despite the many efforts and investment made by the Cuban government in our public health system, this is an area that continues to be hard hit by the blockade. And this has been especially the case during the COVID-19 pandemic, given to actions taken by the Trump administration to put additional pressure on our public health system by making it difficult to purchase urgently needed materials, equipment, and other input to save lives. Already in the early moments of the pandemic in Cuba, the blockade was the reason behind the transport company's refusal to send to Cuba the cargo of a donation of mechanical pulmonary ventilators, diagnostic kits, masks, and other medical supplies needed to confront COVID-19, sent by the Chinese company Alibaba, all because the transport company's main shareholder was a US company. Another example was when the Emirates Airlines rejected a shipment to Cuba of an important drug used to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, arguing that they could not transport goods destined for Cuba given the blockade. This situation considerably delayed the delivery of said drug, having to urgently look for another commercial alternatives. Cuba is also denied the acquisition of hearing aids with state-of-the-art technology, including batteries and spare parts, due to the 10% US component. It is almost impossible to have access to different alarm equipment created for deaf people, such as baby alarms, alarm clocks, light bells, among others, since the most affordable equipments have more than 10% of US components. The difficulties in the fuel supply to Cuba as a result of the persecution unleashed by the US government led to a situation between November and December 2019 where it was not possible to plant 12,399 hectares of rice. Because of this, 3,130 tons of rice were not produced for consumption. Due to the same reason, more than 195,000 tons of other foods were not produced. Additionally, more than 2 million liters of milk and 481 tons of meat could not be collected. All of this had a negative impact on the diet of the Cuban population. Additionally, the US government has ensured that our citizens are cut off from receiving remittances, and Lamrani just mentioned this, sent by their family members living abroad, and has denied their access to consular services to travel to the US, ever since the US Embassy in Havana closed their consular services. These measures add an additional layer of suffering for families on both sides of the Florida Straits. But the impact of the blockade is not only felt by the Cubans at home. For Cubans living abroad, the blockade regulations are also a daily obstacle. They are prevented from opening bank accounts, using certain credit cards, or carrying out normal transactions just because they have the Cuban nationality. This policy also means a restriction for US citizens whose right to travel to Cuba is heavily regulated. The inflow of US visitors would be a natural fit for our tourism sector. But because of the blockade, this has been erratic at best, meaning the loss of an estimated $1.7 billion between 2019 and 2020. I could go on for hours enumerating the many different examples of how the blockade affects Cuba, its people, our businesses, and countries around the globe. I invite you to take a look at Cuba's report on the matter that you can read or download from the website for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Regarding the history of the General Assembly resolution, I would have to say that Cuba has presented this initiative for the last 28th consecutive year, a resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Blockade Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. The UN General Assembly first considered this initiative in 1992. And it was a very particular context. It was a year or a context where we have lost our economic ties with the former socialist bloc. It was the period of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the socialist bloc. So it was an initiative that coincided very much with something that was already mentioned by Salim, which was the passing of the Torricelli Law, which was a step further in order to disrupt the Cuban economy and produce the collapse of the Cuban society. So this was actually the step that triggered the initiative presented by Cuba in the General Assembly. So in 1992, when we presented to the General Assembly for the first time this initiative, we had the support of 59 member states and only 3 votes against: the US, Israel, and Romania. It was a great victory, but we knew that more could be done. We knew more countries could see the merits of our claim, which is why so many from the 71 who had abstained in 1992 joined in support in 1993, elevating the votes in favor to 88. From then on, it became a gradual wave of support. By 1995, we had already 117 votes in favor. Then in 1996 came yet another law by the US Congress, the famous Liberty and Democracy Solidarity Act on Helms-Burton Act, which codified the provisions of the blockade and extend the extraterritorial scope, as already mentioned as well by Lamrani, imposing sanctions on executives of foreign companies who carried out transactions in US properties nationalized in Cuba, and also opened the possibility of filing lawsuits in the US courts. It likewise limited the president's prerogative to suspend the blockade. This time, the initiative was updated to reflect more in detail the new circumstances of the time with the new legislation passed by the Congress. The number of member states in support of our resolution at that time did not waver and instead rose to 137 member states in support of the resolution. This was not just the result of Cuba's activism in trying to garner support for our resolution, but because more countries came to understand the gravity of the US blockade and how it had been strengthened by this new legislation, which now ensure that a so-called bilateral issue that never was had become more clearly a multilateral one. Over the years, the support continued to increase as less and less countries abstained and were absent. Although sometimes other countries voted against the resolution, the two contents in that grouping have always been the US and Israel. Only in 2016 did these two countries abstain, reflecting a singular moment of our bilateral relation and the process opened under the Obama administration. Today, this resolution is considered an example within the UN community of one of the very few documents of its type that garners such widespread support short of a consensus adoption. The resolution carries a great political weight. It is a clear cut-off signal that the majority of the international community is of one mind when it comes to this issue, therefore leaving those who oppose it very much isolated. For the people of Cuba, it means that we're not alone, and it encourages us to keep fighting until this illegal policy is struck down. That is why, and until that happens, we will continue to present this resolution for the consideration of the General Assembly. And this year, that would occur next June, on the 23rd of June, And of course, I would not be able to advance what would happen, but for sure, we will count, and we believe that that we will continue to count with the support of the majority of the international community and back in Cuba on this initiative. You have referred to the role of the international community and the international solidarity movement. And of course, we think and we view the role of the international solidarity movement as essential to continue making awareness and raising awareness. Actions like this one that we are undertaking this afternoon, this webinar, some others that have been carried out in the previous months and some others that will come. Important initiatives like Building Bridges of Love initiative that yesterday gave a magnificent example of coordinated chain of caravans calling for the lifting of the embargo are absolutely essential in raising awareness of governments. I really believe that if it was not also for this magnificent international solidarity movement, governments would have not been able or would have delayed in getting conscience and on the impact and importance of accompanying Cuba in this initiative, that also because also the blockade have not only an impact on Cuba, but it has a very large extraterritorial implication that affects all those who want to enter in a very legitimate relationship with Cuba. So with this, I will leave it at this, and I will rest open for any questions that participants might wish to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Pedroso, for your full explanation. It's really great to hear from somebody working at the United Nations in the whole process to do with the vote that is coming up this year, how that is going to progress. And obviously, in a minute, we'll hear from Paula Barker, a member of parliament here, who is directly involved in working with our government to try to make sure that our government maintains its vote against or in favour of the Cuban resolution. Just when you were speaking, and Salim also, it always brings to the experiences we have of the blockade, to the extraterritorial nature of the blockade. Of course, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Cuba Solidarity Campaign itself had all of its bank accounts closed down because of the extraterritorial nature of the blockade and the threats of the multi-million pound fines from the Office of Foreign Asset Control. And a few years ago in 2017, a young Cuban student who applied to go to a university here in the UK, the Open University, was banned from even applying to go to the university because of the extraterritorial application and of the blockade and the threats. In fact, we run a big campaign with the trade unions, with members of parliament, and we won a legal case against the Open University, but we won it on race relations legislation, equalities legislation, because of course it was discriminatory against the whole of the Cuban people. But the blockade is omnipresent, as you both mentioned, and it impacts on everybody around the globe. And at the moment it is virtually impossible for people to send money from the UK to Cuba, and that is a real problem that we're finding right now. I'd like to welcome all of you who are watching. We have over 200 people watching on Zoom and YouTube right now. Those of you on YouTube, if you could click on the like button and subscribe to YouTube, we'd be really grateful. I'd like to welcome people, Sylvia from Sunderland, Ruth from Canada. We've got people from Manchester, Bradford, Christine from Sweden, Alex from Miami, and Ike from, I think, New York. We've got Joanne from Wales, Daisy from Ireland, Edgar from Germany, and people from all across the globe and across the UK. So you're very, very welcome. And it's great to have you all with us here today. As I said, our final speaker before we take questions is a very, very good friend, Paula Barker, Member of Parliament, who has also just been elected, I'm pleased to say, as one of the vice chairs of the all-party parliamentary group on Cuba in Westminster. So we're very, very pleased. Paula's been involved with Solidarity for many, many years. And when she was a trade unionist for Unison up in the Northwest, she was involved in Solidarity. And I'm delighted that Paula has continued working in Solidarity with Cuba now that she's a Member of Parliament. Over to you, Paula.
Thanks, Rob, and I'm really honoured and delighted to be joining you this evening and to be part of this wonderful panel. And it's wonderful to see our friend Barbara as well. Really nice to see you this evening. So as Rob has already said, I've been involved with Solidarity for Cuba for many years now, and it started when I was a trade union activist for Unison. And I think we've heard a lot this evening, lots of information this evening, but it has been really disappointing that after, relatively positive moves under Obama to re-establish relations with Cuba, that this was then reversed under the Trump administration. And of course, we are hopeful that the new Biden presidency will see an improvement in the US-Cuba relations. And, the tightening of the blockade, the policies of Donald Trump's administration towards the last 4 years have caused real suffering for the Cuban people. But I'm glad to say that we don't have that history in Britain. And there's, of course, certainly a lot more that the British government could do to challenge the US blockade policy towards the island, although diplomatically we've been strengthening relations. In 2019, we saw the visit of Prince Charles to Cuba, which followed the visit of the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, to London in 2018. And the all-party group of Cuba, of which I'm one of the vice chairs, as Rob has said, was honoured to host the president during his visit to the British Parliament. And my colleague, Graham Morris, who's the chair of the APPG on Cuba in the British Parliament, has also raised the question of cooperation with Cuba at recent parliamentary questions. So we're pleased to hear that the UK government statements about joint projects between our two countries. And the last British-Cuban ambassador to Cuba, Dr. Anthony Stokes, said late last year that cooperation between our countries is essential in responding to the challenges posed by COVID-19. And of course, the British Embassy announced funds from the Foreign Office International Programme to support Cuba in its response to COVID-19 and at home, and also research into treatment and vaccines for COVID-19. And I hope that the new British ambassador to Cuba, Sir George Hollingbury, will continue with these positive policies. And we've seen some wonderful examples of cooperation between our two countries in recent months, including joint research between the University College London and the Cuban Centre for Biotechnology into COVID testing. And just last week, the British Embassy in Havana held a joint workshop on climate change and sustainability in farming with the Ministry of Agriculture in Cuba. And cooperation such as this is vital for the future of the planet, not just relations between our two countries. I know that the British Embassy in Havana worked with Cuba to support the posting of Cuban medical brigades to the British overseas territories of Anguilla and Turks and Caicos Islands in July last year, and we really do appreciate Cuba's medical support to fight COVID-19 here. I'd like to take the opportunity once again to thank the Cuban government for being the only country willing to accept the British cruise ship MS Braemar into its port in April 2020 at the start of the pandemic, to allow passengers, including some who were infected with COVID-19, to be repatriated to Britain. And we want to build on these positive relations, as there's a lot that both countries can learn from each other. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us nothing if not that international cooperation is now more important than ever before. So I'd like to add my praise for the inspirational internationalism of the Cuban medical brigades. And I'm really proud to have been one of 28 British parliamentarians who formally nominated Cuba's Henry Reeve International Medical Brigade for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. For providing humanitarian and medical assistance to the populations of countries hit by natural disasters and epidemics, including COVID-19. And while the world is suffering through the coronavirus pandemic, it's been truly inspirational to watch how Cuba has assisted other countries in the fight against COVID. More than 4,000 Cuban doctors, nurses and technicians have responded to overseas requests to help fight COVID-19. by volunteering as part of the island's international medical brigades. They've travelled to 40 countries, including Jamaica, Italy, Angola, and Azerbaijan. And it's not the first time that Cuban medics have answered the international call to respond to a health emergency. They do so all over the world, and most notably in 2014 during the Ebola crisis, and in 2005 following the terrible Kashmir earthquake. So this meeting is focusing on the US blockade and the upcoming vote at the United Nations. And I think it's really, really important to reiterate that the US blockade also impacts on us here in Britain. British companies, as Rob was alluding to before, are stopped from trading with Cuba. British banks have been fined under the blockade legislation. As Rob has also said, Cuba Solidarity had its own bank account closed down a few years ago. And there was also the student who Rob was talking about, who had the threat over studying at the British Open University. So I want to give my assurances to the Cuban guests here tonight that we will continue to work for positive relations between our two countries and to pressure the US and fight for an end to the US blockade of Cuba, regardless of who is in the White House. And I'll certainly be contacting the UK government to make sure that they continue their policy of voting against the blockade at the United Nations. And the final thing I wanted to say is that myself and 35 other members of Parliament have signed an early day motion. It's EDM 1550, which calls for the US administration to improve relations with Cuba and remove it from its completely ridiculous state sponsor of terrorism list. It also urges the British government to do more to strengthen relations, and I'll be encouraging my parliamentary colleagues to add their names to this call. But I would appeal to all our viewers out there tonight on YouTube, if you are in Britain, please contact your Member of Parliament and get them to sign up to EDM 1550. It's really, really important that we have as much support as possible to apply as much pressure as possible on our British government. So once again, thank you so much for this invitation to speak tonight, and Viva Cuba.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula. Thank you so much once again. And as Paula said, EDM early day motion is an official parliamentary motion in Parliament right now. In fact, the good news, Paula, is it's been signed by 39 members of Parliament so far. So it's going up all the time. And what has been amazing is that almost 1,000 people have used the urgent action we put online, which helps people to write to their members of Parliament. So over nearly 1,000 people have already taken that action, and they've written already to about 500 members of Parliament. And that action is a direct way in which you can help influence members of Parliament, and in doing so help influence the British government to show that the people of Britain and their representatives want better relations with Cuba. And the links to the action, I'm sure, are being shown on the chat right now. I'd like to thank David, who's just joined the Cuba Solidarity campaign tonight. So you're welcome on board. That's brilliant news. And I'm going to come to the questions. Before that, I want to thank everybody, all of our speakers. And before I take the first question, just to say, we as an organisation, I don't like doing this, but I have to. We're not out and about fundraising because of COVID. So if any of you can give anything, even if it's just a small amount of money, a small donation, it would be gratefully received to help fund the work of the Cuba Solidarity campaign at this time. And again, I think there are links on there and you can do that via the website. So that would be wonderful. Okay, we've got a number of questions and a few from tonight. I'm going to try and get through them as quickly as we can. We've got about 15-20 minutes left. So the first question, I think probably to Ambassador Pedroso, is from Joe Shoba, and it says, could we hear a little bit more about some of the obstacles that have been created by the blockade in terms of Cuba's struggle against the coronavirus? And for example, he says, or she says, I'm sorry, I'm not sure, I understand vaccine trials have been conducted in Iran, and I wonder whether this is a result of Cuba's limited options of countries to cooperate with. Is that an impact of the blockade? So about coronavirus and how the blockade has impacted on Cuba's response. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I think we have to understand that the blockade has a very really a multidimensional effects, and particularly in terms of the pandemic, when we're coming from a period from where the U.S. administration adopted, as I mentioned, more than 200 new actions in an attempt to bring Cuba to its knees, then if that situation confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we're facing scarcities of many many different areas, but also confronted in trying to have access to technology, because combating the pandemic, you cannot do it just with simple things. You have to apply technology like the pulmonary ventilators, a special sort of treatments, and doesn't matter how much advanced we are, and actually we have, if it was not because of the development we have in our biotech industry and in the health sector as a whole, it would have been much worse. But certainly the blockade have make a big obstacles in our capability of trying to combat the pandemic, and also in trying to have more international cooperation with other countries that are facing the same. There has been a lot of threats to countries would have wished to have Cuban cooperation to help them in combating COVID-19 pandemic, and there have been, threat by the U.S. Government, possibilities of Cuban joining in international initiatives are also been prevented because of the blockade. So certainly, yes, it has had an impact, not only in times of COVID, but also worsened because of the context in which we are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. I've got a question here from, it's a question we get asked a lot, and I'm pleased it's been asked tonight, and maybe Salim and possibly the Ambassador may want to come back as well. But the blockade, sorry, I'm not sure who that question's from, but I think it came up tonight. Can you explain how the blockade seems to affect some companies and some products, but not others? And the person says, for example, how is it that you can perhaps see Coca-Cola on sale in Havana, in hotels and shops in Cuba, when it's a US product? For example, how is it that Virgin Airlines can fly to Cuba and can also fly to the United States? It seems quite arbitrary. Could you explain a bit about that? Because it's a question that comes up a lot, and it's also a question that comes up from people who say there is no blockade. Perhaps Salim could start, and maybe the Ambassador as well.
I have a question first. Is Virgin Airlines a British company or an American one? Yeah. Yes, hopefully. Yes, as it is a British company, they can travel to Cuba, like Air France can travel to Cuba and can travel to the US as well. The economic sanctions are not, fortunately for Cuba, do not limit everything. Otherwise, Cuba wouldn't be able to survive. But we can't, to give an example regarding the airlines, Cuba can't buy. You have two big companies in the world, which is Airbus, which is a European one, and you have Boeing, an American one. Obviously, Cuba can't buy any Boeing plane because it's an American company. But Cuba can't even buy an Airbus airplane, which is European, because it has more than 10% of its component. 10% of its component that are from the US. So if a product contains more than 10% of US components, they can't be sold to Cuba. It indicates you how limited Cuba is when they want to buy things in the international market, and when they have to sell things in the international market. What was the first aspect of it, Rob? I didn't get it.
It was also, they mentioned Coca-Cola. That sometimes you can buy Coca-Cola sometimes in Cuba, and how can that be if it's because of the blockade?
Yeah, maybe Ambassador Pedroso could answer to that, but I think there's still a Coca-Cola company in Cuba. I'm not sure about it.
No, for sure, it's not a Coca-Cola company in Cuba. It's an American company. It would not be able to be in Cuba. You mentioned the example of Airbus. I mean, but Cuba cannot even rent Airbus. It's not only a question of buying; it's a question of renting. Cuba cannot buy spare parts for planes or machines, equipment they used to have, because they have the 10% component of American products, as I mentioned before. Rob, you mentioned, I mean, you can find sometimes Coca-Cola, or you might find in some stores sometimes, I don't know, Adidas or whatever. I'm not going to. All what I want to. The point what I want to make is extremely difficult for Cuba to get whatever. If we want to provide some sort of variety in our market, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare that Cuba has to go through to acquire whatever, even sometimes a Coca-Cola, to provide some variety in the market. But the fact that you might find sometimes an American product in Cuba, that doesn't mean that there is a sustained, availability of those products in the Cuban market. It's very, I mean, you can find it today and you cannot find it tomorrow. And you can find it this month, and in 2 months' time, it's disappeared. Because there is no, stability in the market. There's no stability in the supply, precisely because of the embargo. But it's really a nightmare for Cuban companies and Cuban enterprises to go along and try, of course, to avoid the blockade in the markets where we are able to operate.
Thank you, Ambassador and Salim. I mean, I'm sure some of these products are coming via third-party countries as well, which can mean that they're available sometimes via different routes and so on, but they may come via different routes. Okay,
Rob,
yes.
Rob, sorry, can I just mention, to go with the Coke and to show solidarity with our Cuban friends, most good supermarkets these days sell Havana Club. So if you're a rum drinker, please buy a bottle of Havana Club, and also make sure that you log on to CSC, because they've got a variety of products, including wonderful Cuban coffee and chocolate. And, if you can, then, purchase some, because, these small steps of solidarity really, really does help.
Thank you, Paula, for that boost as well. Thank you. We have a question here from a couple of people. I'm going to merge a couple of questions. They're both about the blockade vote at the United Nations. And one question is from Patricia, which says, if the majority of the world vote against the blockade at the United Nations, why is it still permitted? Which is a very straightforward question to ask. And that's backed up by Stephen Bailey, who also says, if the UN vote can't change the policy, and I'm sure you'll explain why it can't or why it doesn't, why is it important to campaign for the high level of votes at the United Nations? If you could answer those, Ambassador, Salim, either of you.
Even though still it's very important, and certainly, I mean, what happened is a General Assembly resolution is not legally bound on the U.S. or any other country, but it carries a political imperative, a moral imperative from the international community, and to us there is no doubt that a resolution like that one, passed by a vast majority of member states, makes a very clear political signal of the U.S. And I think on the end, ultimately, that resolution, the isolation of the U.S. policy all around the globe, like in our own region, for example, the situation that the U.S. have to face when it was confronted at the America Summit by most of the Latin American, Caribbean governments, that left them in a very bad position. All that, and together with the actions of the solidarity movement, I think were a very contributing factor to make the previous administration, the Obama administration, to understand that they had to produce a change in policy, because it was a very outdated policy that just produced isolation for the U.S. So we have to keep on the battle, even if they don't abide by that political message, but it still is quite an important political message.
Salim, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I think Ambassador Pedroso summed it up well. Obviously, the UN resolution has a political impact. Even if it doesn't have any legal one, it has a political impact because it shows that the US foreign policy towards Cuba is isolated and rejected by everyone, including the best allies of the United States. Barack Obama took the decision to change US policy towards the island in 2014, partly because of the international rejection of US foreign policy of the economic sanctions. So it doesn't have any legal impact, but it has a very strong political one.
Well, thank you so much, Salim. I'm going to start to wrap the meeting up. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to say any final words or have any messages for the audience before I sum up.
I just want to reiterate my appreciation, Rob, for the invitation, to my colleague, Barbara, to all of you. Has been a magnificent company, and to encourage you to keep going. This is quite an important thing for Cuba, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, two ambassadors. Thank you, Salim, and thank you, Paula, so much tonight, because it's been a very instructive and informative first meeting about the blockade. We do have two more meetings coming up. We're going to have another one with a spokesperson from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who's going to really dig deep into the impact of the blockade. And for any of you who wants to, you can read Cuba's motion, Cuba's report. It's available on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and I think we'll put a link up on our website. And it's a fascinating document because it shows the depth and the breadth of the impact of the blockade, not just on Cuba, but on international companies and individuals around the world. And it really shows why it is such a cruel and inhumane and illegal sanction against this small country. As well as that, after the vote in June, we'll have another meeting on the blockade, looking at the vote, looking at some of the speeches, some of the supporting comments from the other countries, because again, it shows that Cuba isn't alone, and it shows that really it is the United States and Israel who are isolated when it comes to their Cuba policy. Cuba Solidarity Campaign is also organising a commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the victory at the Bay of Pigs, Playa Giron, in April, which you can look out for. And we'll also be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Great Literacy Campaign, which is an anniversary this year. And if you want to come to those meetings, then please follow us on social media, sign up to our email newsletter, Cuba Update, and then you will be notified about all of these events. finally, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming tonight and attending this meeting. Over 200 people on YouTube and Zoom. It was great to see you all here tonight. But finally, I'd like to give a very big thanks to all of our guests on the panel here, to Ambassador Barbara Montalvo Alvarez for attending, to Paula Barker, MP, thank you so much, to Salim Lamrani. I hope to see you soon in Britain, Salim, not just on the telly with Bielsa this time, maybe coming when you come over here, we'd like to see you that way. And finally, of course, to our very special guest, Ambassador Pedroso. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time, and onwards to victory and onwards to a great vote at the United Nations. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.